Welcome back to the Pre-Vetted podcast, where we spotlight extraordinary people and remarkable talent reshaping our world. Today, we're joined by Sophora Acheson.
Yes, you got it.
I pronounced it correctly, right?
Yes.
Sophora Acheson. She's a therapist and nonprofit executive who leads Restorative Pathways, Ruby's Place, supporting underserved communities across multiple counties. Sophora's work focuses on trauma, relationships, and breaking generational cycles, helping people move from perpetuating harm to perpetuating healing. Sophora, welcome to the show.
Thank you. That was an amazing introduction. I should take you everywhere with me.
Happy to join you, and just,
Yes.
I am the official introduction.
Yep.
Yes. So, tell us about, what you do.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I get asked that a lot. I really break it down to I'm in the business of connection because connection is what I would say perpetrates healing and really where we can get down to the root causes of trauma and violence. So I know that's kind of a really, philosophical way of thinking about it. But on a day-to-day basis, my 9 to 5 is running Restorative Pathways and working with an amazing team of people. We have 9 sticks and bricks facilities across California, and we're in partnership with one facility in Colorado. And those facilities are really a continuum of care. And that means that anybody from those who are in crisis who may need a safe house. So, we do work with folks that are coming out of really dangerous situations, whether it's domestic violence, human trafficking, or some other violent type of situation, to folks that are experiencing homelessness because of a past trauma. We have emergency shelters, transitional housing, long-term housing. We have a trauma recovery center, which is really at the heart of what we do. And we're looking at all sides to the puzzle. And what I mean by that is, traditional victim services, which, is amazing work, really goes to the person after the violence or the crisis has started. And one thing that really kind of dawned on me when I was doing direct service in the shelter about 10 years ago was how are we addressing the people that are doing harm and providing them some healing so that they can stop perpetuating the violence and really breaking that cycle. So that was a really long-winded answer of what I do, and I could probably keep going on, but yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I think it's, as I said, it's an underserved community because usually a lot of the programs from government are designed to the harm. There is
Yes.
an act of violence, then what we do. And after that, usually there is, and I'm painting a general brush, right? But
Yeah.
usually there is no follow up, right? And
Right.
I was learning about this idea of prevention, right? The situations escalate, right? So
Yes.
there are things we can do to prevent from becoming a violent situation, right?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. A little bit more about me. I'm a survivor myself, both as a child of family violence, but also when I, early adulthood, found myself in a relationship with an abusive partner, which really isn't any surprise because for many folks who experience violence as a child, can either perpetuate it or can find themselves, in a relationship where that is present because it's often normalized, as we grow up in families. So I knew that I wanted to be in some sort of social services. And after lots of schooling and having the blessing and privilege of access to education, I started my career working at a domestic violence shelter. And one of the things that they tell you about quite a bit when you're training to answer the crisis call or, welcome people into the shelter who have experienced domestic violence is you're often going to see the same person over and over. Because statistically, what we know is that somebody will leave up to 7 times their partner before they leave for the last time. And so, they talk about this a lot and really try to prepare you because when you're working with folks, it's hard to see somebody go back to their situation or, choose to return to a toxic situation. And so that I felt like I was really kind of prepared for. But then something happened that I wasn't prepared for at all and really brought into question a lot of how we look at prevention. And it was, shortly after I had been, running the shelter for a while, I started to notice that we were actually seeing different women with the same person that does harm or the same abuser is what, we generally call it. And I thought, okay, wait a second. They told me that we would see the same person over and over again, but we wouldn't see different people. And that really kind of stopped me in my tracks. And I actually started thinking about my past and, my father and, um, my ex partner who were both abusive. And I started thinking about how many people would they essentially impact as somebody who uses violence and harm in their relationships. And I was like, there has to be a intervention prevention program that really addresses that. And a really long story short, there isn't, at least not in the United States. And so I went on, like, I put on my backpack like Dora the Explorer and was like off to, around the world, really trying to find what programs existed. And that landed me in New Zealand. They've been running a program for those that do harm for the past 10 years. And so I spent quite a bit of time with them to be able to bring back those models and philosophy to the United States. So
Wow.
that's really sort of at the core and the passion and kind of the innovation that we're really focusing on at Restorative Pathways.
Right. Well, first, I'm sorry to hear that you suffered abuse, and you're victim of domestic violence. The other thing I was reading about this is that, and you mentioned it, that there's generational cycles that,
Yes.
if the father is violent and the son or daughter are going to be violent.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned that, you know, there is a seek for that type of relationship because the way I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that's the definition of love that they understand, right? That's the best
Yes.
thing that they know, right?
Yes. Yeah. My clinical hat on in terms of, being a therapist, what I now internalize that is I was shown a way of conflict resolution, right? If anybody was upset in my household or had a big emotion or was in a disagreement with somebody else, you screamed, you yelled, you broke things, and eventually it would escalate to violence. And so as a kid, I really thought every family just operated that way. I had no other baseline or, um, model of what conflict resolution really looked like. And to your point, that then starts to translate into well, if somebody really cares about me, then they will be so passionate that it could be violent or, it could be really toxic. Because again, that's what your example of somebody who is supposed to really care about you, your parents, show you right off the bat. And so it really hit me, around 5-ish that I had to actually relearn how to argue. And it was
Right.
around yeah, it was around the time that with my now husband, we were getting ready to get married, and he's like, "Look, I love you, but, like, we can't argue in these big explosive ways." And I'm like, "Well, what do you mean? Everybody does that." And he's like, "No, Sephora, they don't." And I was really taken back by that and really kind of upset and, struggled with a lot of shame because, at 25 years old, you're an adult. You should have all the tools to be able to be in relationship and disagree with people. And I didn't have that. And so I really had to make a choice on whether or not I was going to go get support and help and therapy and learn essentially conflict resolution and how to fight and argue with my partner in a healthy way. Or the other choice was eventually I was going to continue to perpetuate this, kind of toxic cycle of conflict and violence. And um yeah, that was a really hard season for me for sure.
Because it redefined your whole foundational.
Yes.
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 One of the things I have a 10-year-old, and one of the things we learned in that process is, uh, I was taught to not express my emotions, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
It was the best thing my parents knew about, so that, there's
Right.
things we don't talk about because
Yep.
that's how things are, right? So
Yeah.
when we learn about that is that if we don't, so for my son, if he doesn't express his emotions, he doesn't identify them and process them, then those emotions become much more worse,
Yes.
right? Anger
Yes.
become rage, sadness becomes depression, right?
Yes.
So I learned that, and when I've been talking about this type of topics, I realized that as an adult, both the men and the women, or whatever it is on the couple, both don't know how to express their emotion and how to communicate more effectively
Yes.
without escalating into an argument.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned kids. I have a 7 and a 9-year-old, and whoa, when my kids came into the picture, they were like a mirror, held up all of the things that I needed to really see about myself. And, they really challenge you to get not only how you want to raise your children, but how you deal with things yourself. And so my kids have been a huge, motivation and just blessing and continuing the healing process.
Right. Right. Yes. You were talking about how do you react when somebody would, scream or would,
Yeah.
raise the voice. And I think that there is a biological root for that, is that mostly women are biologically inclined to protect, right? So the baby cries and
Yes.
they're used to, you know, protect it because otherwise the baby dies, right? So without any other tools, they do the same, in the relationship, and then they take
Yes.
in, they take in, they take in, right? And
Yes.
that becomes a toxic behavior that reinforce the bad behavior, right?
Absolutely. It does. And then, these kind of learned behaviors, pass to our children and, further and further. And then you get, the intergenerational transmission of trauma and, whatever that may be. And I think it's interesting because I feel like, I don't want to age myself here, but, the kind of, uh, Gen X generation is really kind of the first ones that really helped take away the stereotype or the taboo. That's the word I'm looking for. The taboo around talking about trauma, about talking about therapy and, getting help. And, our parents definitely were doing the best that they had with the tools that they had, at their fingertips. And really happy to see, this generation of parents and now passing it down to their kids, that we get to talk about our feelings and we get to address things that we're doing wrong and learn new tools and figure out ways to, navigate life. Yeah, so it's pretty great to see, I think, that the shifts that are happening in society as well.
Right, right. And I think it becomes important we're kind of talking about, first, we as adults need to learn how to express our feelings, how to process our feelings. That doesn't mean necessarily to slash out, to be able to ask for a timeout, right? Just,
Yeah.
I'm angry.
Yes.
Let me calm down, right? Because then with that, by example, we can show our kids
Yes.
how to resolve that conflict or whatever it is as a couple.
Yes. Yeah.
That is much more effective than whatever we tell them, right? That they can
Oh,
see us,
100%. Yes.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because I was raised where those discussions happen closed doors, right?
Mm,
And of course, as kids, you hear all that, right?
sure.
You perceive
You
what's going
feel
on,
it.
right? You
Yeah.
feel it. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So
Absolutely.
hiding it was not the best strategy, but as you said, is what the best thing my parents thought was the best thing to do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
after we process being able to resolve the conflict, and the other thing I learned is this idea that there is the victim of violence, right? That usually is the woman, but it also happens the other way around. But the core of the issue is the lack of tools on
Yes.
both.
Yes. 100%. Um, you know, talking about feelings and how, you process them, I think one of the biggest things that I had to learn, and that we work with clients that do harm is how to sit in the uncomfortability of feelings that are hard. We try to not use the word like, oh, feelings are bad or good, but anger is not fun. Sadness is not fun. Frustration and, those are not fun feelings to have.
Right,
And part of processing that is learning to sit without lashing out, without, becoming violent to be able to process them is first and foremost being able to tolerate feelings. And that's one thing that we typically see and that I really noticed in myself is my tolerance for big feelings was very minimal. I couldn't sit with it like, "Hey, I need a break. I'm really angry right now. Like, I need to go, sit with that for" that was not an option. And so, long story short, uh, we often really do start with how do you tolerate the feelings? And then part of that is identifying, like, what is it that you're actually feeling? Usually, if somebody says they're angry, I ask what's underneath that because
right,
anger is oftentimes a secondary emotion, right? We're actually really sad or we're feeling abandoned or, there's something else, but anger is the thing that we show up with. In my opinion, anger is often a sign of strength, If I tell you that I'm feeling abandoned or I tell you that I'm feeling sad, we have this kind of subconscious thought that I'm going to look weak, And so the protector in us takes over and is like, but if I show up and angry and stuff like that, well, then I'm strong.
right.
And so, yeah, there's a lot of like going back to the basics with feeling. I remember one of the first times that my husband met my family. He grew up, it sounds very similar to you. We're like, we don't talk about feelings. Stuff happens behind closed doors. We don't, scream and yell. Like if you're gonna argue, you go and then we don't talk about it. Well, I grew up obviously in a very different, like everybody was yelling and screaming. And I mean, that was like a Tuesday, for us. And the first time that he met my family, it was at a dinner and nothing really, like, there was no fight or like real argument or anything. We were having very animated conversations and talking about stuff. And on the ride home, he was just like, what the heck? He's like, I can't believe you grew up in that. Like, I was there for 2 hours and I was overwhelmed by, the kind of craziness that was happening. And that also was a little bit like, not everybody's family, like, is wildly loud and like yells and screams and, is like that with each other. Yeah, there's definitely different ends of the spectrum, and we all have work to do in terms of learning how to cope with our feelings.
Right, right. Yeah. And because we didn't grow up identifying our feelings, we just feel rage for
Yeah,
anything, right? Yeah. There,
100%, yeah.
there is a case that happened a year ago, maybe two. So there was this viral video where a woman was dating uh, but she started screaming at him because he was leaving, and she started banging the car. right? And he's calmed, right? And then he pulls out of the car a machine gun, right? A shotgun, I don't know, right? But
Yeah.
anyway, she continues poking him, right? And then he shoots a warning shot on the floor, right? And the woman, instead of backing down,
Sure.
continues poking him, right?
Yeah.
Then he shoots her in the face, right? Now, people, the people were talking about that, that the guy was a criminal, blah, 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 which he was, right? But then
Yeah.
the way that I see it is that there is that dynamic, right? Where,
Yes.
it happens, both were involved, right? And it's a
Yes.
sadness that it ended on that woman
Yeah.
dead, right?
Yeah.
And then that guy ended up in prison, right? Because the video became viral, and then the police chased him, found him, locked him up,
Yeah.
right? I think that there is a shared responsibility for that situation,
Yes.
and the consequences are terrible. The woman is dead, the
Yes.
guy is locked up, right? And the same thing happens when there is an escalation in violence, where the family ends up split up with resentment to each other and a shared child, right?
Yes.
If we could do something to avoid that escalation, to amend that relationship before it becomes an issue, right? Then I think that is the best possible outcome, because you have a whole family being able to communicate each other, being able to be happy, and being able to raise the child that they have.
Yes, absolutely. I think you're touching on something that is incredibly important, which is in our, philosophy, you can't just treat one side or the other. It really is a whole family dynamic. And actually, our department in our agency that works with this is called Whole Family Services, because we're really looking at all of the dynamics that you were just talking about that contribute to violent situations that unfortunately sometimes do end in, homicide and terrible, tragic endings. But it does take really looking at how is each party coming together and contributing to the escalation of it. We take a very almost like a recovery model, when somebody is quote unquote using or abusing drugs or alcohol, they'll go into a rehab, right? But there's also, they typically recommend that the other family members who are close to this person, get help and treatment themselves, whether it's going to Al-Anon or, getting in counseling themselves to look at what they're doing to either help or hinder the person, right? And so it's very much kind of the same model of when we get a referral or somebody comes in to our facility and says, "Hey, look, I was just arrested. There's now a restraining order against me. And if I don't, get help, I'm going to lose my kids." That's a huge motivating factor why a lot of people, come to us, is because they're on the verge of, more jail time or losing their kids or, something happening. So we will bring them in and we will explain to them, this is the program. These are the things that we're going to work on. We also would like to reach out to your partner, and to your family. And we invite those people in for services, not necessarily in the same place, but we invite them into the program for services. And then when and if the couples decides that they want to reconvene, whether it's, "Hey, look, we don't want to be together anymore, but we have to figure out how to co-parent," or "We actually want to try to reconcile." We have restorative practices that we use, like transformative justice type things, where we can bring both parties together and really talk about the harm that's been done and what is the plan going forward.
Right, right. Because the I call it broken family. Maybe that's not the right
Mhm.
term, but
Yes.
a divorced family or separated family, then the first you have the consequences for the couple, then you have the consequences for the kids, right?
Yes.
Kids from the divorced family are doing worse in all metrics, all possible metrics, right?
Yes.
So there is an important benefit for the kid, to have the family staying together.
Yes.
And then by the time the government gets involved on whether it's alimony or child support or
Yes.
whatever type of system they could be, it's never going to be as good as the couple staying together, right? It's
Yeah.
it's okay, you cannot tolerate each other, but we have a kid, okay, we need the bare minimum to cover, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. But it's a destructive pathway to go, to go towards that. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And what has been the most effective changes you've seen in couples after going through restorative?
Yeah. I'm thinking of several couples who have come through, um, our program where typically, the man goes and stays in a residential facility called His House, and he gets wraparound services. We're talking case management, there's peer to peer accountability. We run a curriculum there that's really looking at his trauma and kind of what brought him to using violence. And then, we often have moms, usually with kids, who come to stay in our DV shelter, and they're getting similar wraparound services there. Talking to them and hearing when they decide to leave the shelter, which we definitely have lots of both, meaning they get back together or they're, living separately but co-parenting. Quite a few of them have said, if I did not go through this program, I would have either ended up dead or had to stay in hiding. Or, the men have said, I would have either really harmed my partner or been in prison. And that's not to say that we're perfect or it's a glorified program or any of that. What it's really talking about is people's lack of hope before they came in versus when they leave. They really do have a clear path forward of how am I going to continue to live a life that is not full of violence and lack of safety.
Right. Right. There is I remember the author, but he wrote a book about the. I will look up the book title, but he talks about that 95+% of men that are in prison is because they lack a father figure, right? Which would avoid them to go to prison.
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody to teach and guide them. Yes.
It's a boy crisis, something
It
like that.
is.
Yeah, Warren Farrell, he wrote The Boy Crisis. Yeah.
The boy crisis.
And he talks about these issues where he interviewed a lot of men in prison, and he talks about that. And the same apply with the couple, right? If they
Uh-huh.
are unable to function in society,
Yes,
then they are not unable to have a functional family.
absolutely. I mean, we also get a lot of couples where the domestic violence is actually pretty equal, back and forth, where they're really fighting with each other. And then they find themselves, they can't get housing because they keep getting evicted because, they're breaking things in the house and the neighbors are calling the cops, or, they keep losing jobs because, one is showing up and making a big scene and all of that. And, you know, domestic violence really impacts people, not just in the home, but really their ability to live and survive.
Right. It's a cycle.
Uh-huh.
We said it before.
Yeah.
And you also talk about somatic experiences, right?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. So this is where I'm going to get really nerdy with, therapy therapy modalities. This has happened in my personal journey, but I've also seen it professionally be really impactful, and that's looking at how trauma lives within the body. There's very famous, doctors and stuff out there, and Bessel being one of them, who wrote, the body keeps score, and really talking about the actual biological processes of what happens to us when we do go through trauma, especially kids who have grown up in a traumatic situation. The brain stem develops differently. Our brain, and neural networks wire differently. And somatic work, which is really looking at the different parts of the body, how the nervous system reacts, how our breathing reacts, how we actually hold emotions biologically, not just, cognitively work through the emotions, but when cortisol and epinephrine and all of that stuff gets released into our system when we are going through a really activated space, how our body actually handles that and holds that. And so we've really seen a lot of effective things around doing what you would call somatic or body work. And that's everything from breath work, which, as simple as it sounds, is at the top of the most effective on how we reteach our nervous system to regulate, which, my gosh, I literally didn't even know that was a thing until I was in my 30s. I'm like, "What do you
Wow.
mean I have to teach my nervous system how to regulate? Isn't that like a just a isn't it like a computer? It just automatically does its thing?" Um, and it was a huge change for me. I remember, after months and months of doing body work and really looking at sort of the biological impact of trauma, I was like, "Oh, is this how normal people feel? Like, they don't feel like they're being chased by a bear every day?" Um, I thought that was just the human experience. And so really integrating a lot of the somatic work into our practices has been really received very well by our clients.
Amazing. Very interesting. I mean, I know that like we have feelings, we store feelings on different parts of our bodies, we feel them on
Yes.
different parts of our bodies, but I didn't
Yes.
realize that trauma continue on the body. Interesting.
Yes, yes. That's a whole I could talk for hours about that. And, there's definitely people out there that are much more knowledgeable and sort of educated than me about this. But it is really fascinating how our bodies really do hold things and how it just deals with it. If we're not actively processing through the trauma, our body will deal with it in the way that it thinks it needs to be done. And I think one of the other things that is really fascinating is how the science community is linking different illnesses, particularly autoimmune and cancers, to trauma and to chronic stress. And I really think that we're gonna see a lot in the next 10 years come out about how do we kind of heal ourselves from the inside out.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
What advice would you give a couple that is struggling through the relationship? Maybe it's not domestic violence yet, but it could
Yeah.
scale there.
Yeah.
What advice would you give them to identify issues and
Yeah.
when should they ask for help?
Yeah. I would say that as soon as you get the feeling, the inkling that it's going in a direction of escalation, that's when you should ask for help. Just statistically, what we know is that violence does escalate. And a lot of couples will say, "Oh, that won't be us. That could never be us." I think that there's also a lot of shame, or not I think, I know that there's a lot of shame, both on, both parties, men, women, same-sex couples. There's a lot of shame in admitting, yeah, we don't function the best, or we have some toxic behaviors in our relationship. And so my advice around that would be there is a lot of non-judgmental help out there. There's a lot of people who are willing to sit down with you and figure out how your relationship can actually be thriving. And it isn't just a one answer, meaning, well, your relationship's toxic, so now you have to break up. And I think that a
Right.
lot a lot of couples do fear that. I do work with couples in my private practice who have had domestic violence in their relationship, and many of them are very nervous because they're like, "Well, she's just going to tell us that the answer is to break up." First of all, I can't make that decision. No therapist, nobody can make that decision for you. And if you're willing to put the work in, you absolutely can have a thriving relationship that is healthy. And so really taking the first step to figure out what are the resources for you and not letting that shame be the driver of not asking for help.
Interesting. And what habits would you recommend couples that will help towards building trust and building a
Yes.
much healthier relationship?
The habit of slowing things down. I think that we often want to resolve conflict right away, right? It's super uncomfortable. I don't want to sit with this. There's the old saying, don't go to bed angry. There's all of that. And so we can often rush through the process of conflict resolution and repair. Repair is the most important thing. That's actually how we build intimacy. Esther Perel talks about, she's a total expert in couples, but she talks a lot about how we really can't have intimacy without rupture and repair, because that's how we actually build trust that, oh, my person's going to come back and they're going to apologize and we're going to figure it out and this isn't going to ruin the relationship. And so to kind of boil that down, it takes slowing down when there is conflict, and that may look like, hey, I need a timeout. That may look like, okay, we're going to talk about this for 5 minutes and then we're going to pause and we're going to come back to it. Don't rush through conflict resolution and repair.
We say something similar to our son of, he can get angry
Mm-hmm,
and he can go to his room, but
mm-hmm.
lashing out, hitting us or hitting
Yeah.
stuff, that's unacceptable. But, it's okay if he needs some time off.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then he goes
Yeah.
to a room angry,
Mm-hmm,
frustrated or
mm-hmm,
whatever. And then,
mm-hmm.
if we push it to try to, are you okay? Are you okay? We escalate it. So we give him space,
Yeah.
and then he comes back. Now he's okay.
Yeah.
And now,
Yeah.
the situation remains, but now we can talk in a much more calm way and find a solution, right?
Yes.
So, maybe it's a crude example, but I
No,
relate to that.
that's a perfect example. You're teaching him resiliency and you're actually building a deeper connection because he knows I can be mad. I can go sit in my room and my parents aren't gonna scream at me, yell at me, be upset at me because I'm taking a break or abandon me or, leave me or any of that. I get to sit in my emotions and then I get to come back to my parents who are going to help me figure it out. And that really is the same for couples as well.
Yeah, I talk about the kid because because it becomes more evident, and as we grow
Yes.
up, we kind of build layers where we hide the feeling from ourselves,
Yes.
right, and from
Yep.
the rest. It's harder to see it, right, but I think it's the same internal process. So
Mhm.
yeah,
It is. Yes.
amazing. I think we learned a lot. I truly appreciated you being here. We're running out of time. Any
Yeah.
final remarks before we wrap it up?
I don't think so. Thank you very much for having me. I loved our conversation.
Thank you.